So I'm very happy to welcome Edith Romero. Edith is an activist and organizer and poet, originally from Honduras. Since her move to New Orleans, she's been active on issues involving community health, reproductive justice, and health equity. She's an organizer with the Louisiana Abortion Rights Action Committee, shout out, and active with local immigrants' rights organizations. She's currently working on a Spanish language reproductive health program with local schools. And we're, again, very pleased that she's here with us today to relate a very important message about what this war means for the workers here in the United States and workers around the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joseph. And thank you all for being here. I'm so honored to be here with you and sharing and talking about very important struggles. Oh yeah. Thank you. As Joseph said, I'm from Honduras, and so I am very acquainted with U.S. imperialism and U.S. interventions. As some of you may know, the 2009 coup that happened in Honduras was U.S.-backed, and that led the way to a narco-dictator, which fortunately is not there anymore. We were able to get him out, but there's also a history of U.S. imperialism with the banana companies in Guatemala as well. You have the coup against Arbenz, who was trying to do land reform in the 50s, which is really not that long ago. And so with that, I really want to open up this presentation that I prepared for everybody, and it's really about U.S. imperialism, which is really key to our understanding of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and what is going to keep happening. And I have a feeling, it's going to keep happening with other countries that the U.S. targets and that U.S. has interest in as well. And so throughout this whole presentation, really the questions that we want to ask ourselves is, who's profiting from these U.S.-NATO wars, from U.S. imperialism? And who is paying the price for all this suffering, for all this death, for the decimating of the working condition, of living conditions of the workers? And so Joseph gave us a really good overview of U.S. imperialism, but it's important to remember that we've been here before. Throughout history, we've seen this story repeat itself again and again and again. As I said, I have a really good understanding of it in Central America, but it also has happened in every corner of the world. We know well what happened in Iraq, where the U.S. really had interest in the resources and the oil. We've seen it in Afghanistan and Yemen. We are seeing it at the moment in Palestine. We've been seeing it. And here are just a couple of facts of all the suffering that's going on around the world, or that happened around the world. In Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq, and Yemen, almost 1 million, at least 1 million, have been killed in all these countries combined. In Palestine, which is ongoing, we have at least 10,000 Palestinians who have been killed since September 2000, and we are still seeing, until this moment, that the U.S., Israel is receiving $10.5 million a day from the U.S. for the continued violence perpetrated against the Palestinians. As I mentioned, Central America, we saw it in Chile with Pinochet, Guatemala, Cambodia, Angola, Argentina, Libya, Yugoslavia, and in here we have, a combination of interventionism. We have death squads that are U.S. military trained and U.S. funded. We have the CIA, such as Nicaragua, working with the Contras against the Sandinistas. And so we have plenty of examples of U.S. imperialism and what's going on in Ukraine right now. And so, going off of the question, who benefits? Where are the profits going? And really, when we think about it, who's getting wealthier off of this? The first thing that we can think about is defense contractors. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing. And so they're getting wealthy because they're getting all these contracts for the military, for weapons, for equipment. and more, we're gonna see exactly what that looks like in terms of dollars as well. But we also see oil and gas companies, specifically right now with Ukraine, we're gonna talk about it even more. We've seen that Chevron has made record profits from what's going on in Ukraine because of sanctions as well, which we're gonna talk about a little bit. But we also have to think about rich politicians who are invested in oil and gas companies and defense contractors. So their own interests are in it as well with their own investments. The 1%, which we can also talk about rich politicians being part of that. I just put a couple of facts here about the executives of these defense contractors. Of course, we can't miss Jeff Bezos, who also got a contract not that long ago through Amazon for like defense equipment and like a system. They have a big contract with the military now. Elon Musk, who has a big interest in lithium, which, you know, Ukraine also has in the east as well. Elon Musk, who was, what did he say on Twitter? That he would coup whoever they wanted to? Yeah, that Elon Musk. And so we talked a little bit about Iraq. This is just about Iraq. We have $14 trillion that the Pentagon spent in the invasion of Iraq. And just think about that number. Every time that I hear trillion, I'm like, I can't even imagine what that is, what that looks like, I can't start to fathom it. 1/2 of 14 trillion went to defense contractors. Imagine all these funds if they were going to housing, if they were going to healthcare, if they were going to education or to food security. Imagine how that would affect us in our living conditions as workers. So we talked a little bit about oil and gas really profiting from this. And as I said, specifically with gas, liquefied natural gas, right now the US is a top exporter of this in Europe, since Europe is not buying from Russia, and we can also talk about all the sanctions that are going on. But the US has benefited a lot, the US natural gas companies, from what's going on in Ukraine. Here is just a comparison of how oil companies' profits have increased during the war in Ukraine. So we see an exponential growth in the red right here. So we can clearly see who's profiting from what's going on. I think it's very sad and frustrating and angering the fact that we're actually paying. Me as an immigrant, I'm on DACA, I won't ever see my tax dollars in the form of like Medicare, Medicaid, or anything of that. But it's really devastating to me that those tax dollars that we are paying are going to the death and suffering of communities all around the world. Specifically here of workers in Ukraine. This is just a picture of the military spending that's going on with our tax dollars. As you can see, it's around 68% of all our tax dollars are going to military, national security. And you can see here we barely have for health, for education, which, as we know, it's really needed. Who is paying the price? We already talked about who's profiting. We're paying the price with our tax dollars. We're paying the price with poverty. We're paying the price with deteriorating living conditions. We have higher food and gas prices. I can barely afford my energy bill. I don't know if y'all are in the same boat. It's crazy. Cancer Alley, which is in Louisiana, which is the cause of different factories of all the oil industry and gas industry in Louisiana. So it's all connected. Louisiana has the worst health outcomes, which I put that data here as well. Louisiana and Mississippi are usually fighting for the worst health out of the 50 states, and you can see why. 19.6% of all people in Louisiana live in poverty. That's 20 in 100 people are living in poverty, which I think is insane and sad and frustrating. This is just a little bit of, just a few of the politicians here in Louisiana that are profiting from Chevron's wealth. And I also paired it off, this is from Joseph. I paired it off with the bills that they tried to pass. So we know Jeff Landry, who sued to take 100,000 Louisianans off of Medicaid, sued against a $15 minimum wage for federal contractors, sued to allow schools to deny lunches for LGBTQIA youth. That's only a little bit of what he's done. He's still doing. He has that tip line right now for books. Sharon Hewitt, who tried to pass a resolution to dismiss lawsuits against polluting oil companies. I think is crazy, but you can see where the interests are and whose pockets they're in. And Daniel McCormick, who also wanted to remove all taxes on oil and gas, and also wrote a bill trying to make it legal to murder BLM protesters and water protectors.
Cartoon villains.
Yep.
Yes. But they're real.
Yeah.
But they're real. And obviously we can't forget that Ukrainian people or Ukrainian workers are paying the price. We have 7.8 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe. About 70% of Ukrainian workers have lost their labor protections. It's really important to highlight that 14,000 Ukrainians have been killed in Donbass between 2014 with the US, when the US coup happened, and February 2022. That's before this whole conflict became what it is today. And also, this is really important data, Ukraine, after the 2014 coup, Ukraine became the poorest country in Europe. And this also happened in Libya after the bombing as well. To end, I kind of just wanted to talk about the connection between police, ICE, and the military. They're the same thing. They're the same thing. I'm very well schooled on how the US military has, they literally have schools where they send Latin American people to be trained at being anti-insurgents and fighting against communism and socialists, really fighting against any people coming together to fight. We also have US military bases in foreign countries. I think it's like 800 military bases all over the world. And these military bases, I've seen this in Honduras, work with the local police and also work with death squads in those countries. Joseph mentioned a little bit about foreign soldiers being trained in the US. This is all with US funding, this is with US equipment as well. And Joseph shared this important information that I wasn't really aware of. But we have here a cop. I don't know if he was born here in New Orleans. But,
Nope.
Okay.
He's from Minnesota or something like that.
Okay, but he used to be a cop here in New Orleans. So he was terrorizing here in New Orleans and decided to go to Ukraine to terrorize more people. And it's really important to point out the SS Galicia insignia, which is a Nazi insignia or Nazi group. And then the Kraken regiment, you can see that word there, it's a Nazi death squad as well. So it's clear to see the connection between the military, police, ICE, and US imperialism as well. They're all tools of imperialism. pretty much it.
Thank you so much, Edie. So I'm very honored to welcome John Parker. John has been to eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region. He has seen what U.S. NATO is up to, and we're very anxious to hear his firsthand account. John is the national organizer of the Socialist Unity Party, founder of the Harriet Tubman Center in Los Angeles, member of Black Alliance for Peace. I could go on and on, but a longtime anti-imperialist organizer here in the United States, and we're very pleased to have him here in New Orleans today. So welcome, John Parker.
Thank you, and thank you, Workers' Voice Socialist Movement, for inviting me here, and I'm learning a lot. And I can scratch a couple things off too that I was going to talk about because they were covered so well. But AD, right? AD, yeah. I hope we can get you can send that to folks. That's great information. So I gotta, hold on, let me get my timer here. Come on, you stupid watch. Okay.
We'll just take a technical second, I think.
Oh,
We'll
okay,
share
I'll
the-
have to time my
You can,
timer.
yeah. You can take your technical break and we'll take.
Oh, come
You just turn it off.
There.
There you go.
Okay. So, the war in Ukraine, the proxy war against Ukraine started before last February 23rd. It started actually in 2002 when the U.S. Was sending billions of dollars with the State Department's intelligence agencies, like the nonprofits, so-called, the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, and others, were going into the Ukraine to foment regime change and to try to create a civil war there. Now, by 2014, they couldn't get the people to overthrow their own government. So what they had to do was they had to recruit the Nazis to come in. Now, the Nazi Western Ukraine has a history of collaborating with World War II Nazis, so they're kind of easy to find. So they got these Nazi groupings and trained them, gave them billions of dollars so that they could organize and overthrow the government. So they did that. They overthrew a democratically elected government in Ukraine. And one of the folks who trained them, you're probably familiar with, Blackwater. You know, the same folks who were shooting at black people trying to escape the floods in New Orleans here. That's the caliber of the people they were working with. Now these Nazis then became parts of the, as someone else had mentioned, that they became parts of the military. And you know, I think it was a couple days ago, or was it yesterday or a couple days ago, their helicopter crashed and the interior minister, the newspapers, the corporate media talked about it, but they didn't talk about the fact that he was very closely aligned to one of these Nazi organizations, the Azov Battalion. So the Azov Battalion, IDAR, Right Sector, SUB, Svoboda, all these forces were getting integrated into the police forces and into the military. And you're asking yourself, you know, why do they care so much about Ukraine? Well, some other obvious reasons, economic reasons we talked about, used to be the breadbasket of Europe and all of that. And they want to go after Russia and China, but in order to do that, you have to, NATO has to expand. And it had already expanded by about doubled in the last 20 years, NATO had. But it expanded by going east and surrounding Russia like a noose. And NATO is like the most belligerent, aggressive, violent military alliance that the world has ever seen. And when, like you said, the quote, Martin Luther King, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government, he's definitely talking about NATO. And so many countries, that we did a good job of saying what all the countries that NATO has been in, how they've devastated countries and things like that. That NATO decided, once they had the coup government, the United States was able to put in their own cabinet members and basically make sure that any subsequent governments that went after this coup, whether they're elected or not, would be anti-Russian and pro-US. Getting rid of the opposition, the socialist and communist parties, making them illegal, killing folks, doing all those kinds of things, getting rid of the opposition so that they could have full control. And one of the things that they did was they told Ukraine, well, why don't you ask for NATO membership? Now, having a country right on your border with missiles that are only 5 minutes away from Moscow, that's kind of a provocation. Anti-Russian government that's going to do that. And what made it worse is the fact that the military, the leadership of some and maybe most of the military is now by these Nazi forces. So not only is it a threat to your own survival, it's an existential threat, because now you have Nazis with a fascist ideology, the most horrid, inhumane ideology that there can be. Now they're going to be in charge of these weapons. And then Zelensky talked about maybe he wouldn't mind having nuclear weapons. So it's an existential threat to Russia. And then they had, in the Donbass region, which is the east part of Ukraine, it's mostly a Russian-speaking population, over 6 million people there. And after the coup, they started passing laws to say that you can't speak your Russian language and other things like that, because the fascists had said that Russians were subhuman beings. So, of course, the people in the Donbass region said, we don't want to have any part of this backsliding of history, and we want to become independent republics, independent republics. So in the north, in Lugansk, 89% of the people voted to have an independent republic, the Lugansk People's Republic. And in the south of the Donbass region, in Donetsk, they voted 82% to have the Donetsk People's Republic. So instead of honoring that vote, that the very democratic vote that they had, the Ukrainian military came in with tanks and they started attacking civilians. I got to see some of those houses that were attacked after 2014. And basically an unarmed population relative to the Ukrainian military. So this went on for 8 years or so, and 14,000 people were killed by beginning of this latest confrontation in February 23rd. But in February, they couldn't get the job done. The U.S. was trying to provoke Russia and trying to provoke. And by February 15th, they said, it's not working. We need to up this a little bit. So 7 days from February 15th, they upped the bombing from 70 bombs per day to 1,400 bombs per day against the Donbass region. 20-fold, up to 20-fold. And then they amassed 150,000 soldiers on the border of Donbass, getting ready to go right in and finish off that massacre that they started in 2014. And that's why the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic formally asked for the protection of the Russian Federation to come in. The media doesn't want to talk about that because they want to make the Donbass people disappear like they don't exist. But they asked for that protection to protect themselves, to protect their children, and you can understand why after the history that they had. So this intervention that happened in February 23rd by the Russians, if it didn't happen, there would have been a massacre, a genocidal massacre against the people of Donbass. That's irrefutable. So they don't talk about this type of situation, which is why we wanted to go over there. This is why I went over there, to actually find out what's real and what's not real. How do people really feel about this? So folks will say that, there's no Nazi problem there. So when I first got to Lugansk, I participated in a religious conference with Muslim, Jewish, Christian leaders, and the topic of the discussion was the exponential growth of fascism in Ukraine. They were concerned about that, and why is it growing so fast in Ukraine? Well, just imagine that Biden tomorrow, he says, I'm going to start putting statues of Hitler's collaborators all around the country, And then the next day he decides, well, I'm going to start giving buildings to the Klan for free, and to the other white supremacists, and for the purpose of indoctrinating youth into the ideology of fascism. And where you upstairs, you might have lots of books by Hitler, like Mein Kampf, and then downstairs in the gift shop, you have little trinkets that have Nazi insignias on them and things like that. And then to put icing on the cake, why don't we get rid of all the police departments in the country, in the U.S.? Get rid of every police department and replace them with police departments that are run by white supremacists and the Klan and Proud Boys and all those other forces. Now, I'm not exaggerating one iota when I say that this is exactly what is happening in Ukraine today. And this is the reason that folks wanted to, join the Russian Federation for protection. This is the reason why a lot of things are going on, but you never hear about these things. Anthony Blinken went to, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, right? He went to Ukraine back in September, and he gave them another $2.8 billion. And he did that to reward them for the good work that they did. What was the good work that they did? Well, let's just take a random 4 days out of September. And September 19th, the Ukrainian military bombs a building, a civilian building. September 20th, they bomb a school. September 22nd, they bomb a hospital. And that reminds me of when I was in Krymskaya, which is a little more west from the Lugansk city, but it's in the Donbass region. Well, there's a hospital that we visited, a tuberculosis hospital that had been retrofitted by the Ukrainian military for war. By the time I got there, they had been pushed out a week earlier. But I'm looking at this building and I'm looking on the walls, and you see all of these about this size shells, 120 millimeter shells that are lined up all over the place. And then I look on the wall and I see this giant swastika, about a third of this whole wall here. And then you see next to it a sonoran, which is a symbol that the World War II Nazis appropriated. It's a pagan symbol, but they appropriated it for their own things. And the Azov Battalion, that's their symbol. So I saw that, but getting back to the rocket thing, the shell. So the 20th, they bombed the building. 21st, they bombed the school. 22nd, they bombed the hospital. On the 21st, they bombed the hospital. 19, 20, 21. Gonna run out of fingers here. 22, they decided to bomb a minibus, a civilian minibus. And instead of using the 120 millimeter shell, which, by the way, they're for going through tanks and they're for taking down aircraft. That's how powerful these shells are. But instead of the 120, they decided to use a 155 millimeter shell to aim it at a civilian minibus, and of course killing everyone, including a 14-year-old child. Now, you never hear about this stuff on social media. You never hear about this stuff coming out of Ukraine, mainly because there are two main media sources from Ukraine, and one of them is called the Euromaidan Press. The Euromaidan Press is another State Department independent, State Department intelligence asset. They're funded by the National Democratic Institute. They're funded by the British Embassy in Kiev. They're funded by George Soros' Open Society Foundation, which funds regime change funded regime change in Ukraine. Now, they had an interesting story a heart-wrenching story about these people who were killed by the Russians. This person's parents were killed simply because they wanted to bring food and water to a shelter that the Ukrainians had built for Ukrainian peoples who were being targeted by the Russians. So about 3 weeks after that, I went to that same area in Rubizny. That's where the shelter was, in Rubizny. So I went to that shelter in Rubizny about 3 weeks afterwards of the supposed incident, and I talked to the people there, and everyone there said they had left their apartment buildings because they were being bombed by tanks. That was true, but it wasn't the Ukrainian military that was bombing them. It wasn't the Russian military that was bombing them. It was the Ukrainian military that was bombing them, and there were no Russian soldiers in sight. And in addition, it wasn't the Ukrainians that took them to the shelter and gave them protection. It was the Russian military and the Lugansk People's Militia that sent them to the shelter and were protecting them from the Ukrainian military. So it's kind of like truth is turned on its head. But we figure, you know, it's hard to get the truth because during an imperialist war, the U.S. press, they lose their air of objectivity, and they just become tools for the ruling class, for the Pentagon. But we still have social media, right? Which gives the experiences of many people internationally, so we can see things and stuff like that. But nope, Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, TikTok, all these medias. They, on top of them, is the State Department intelligence organizations that participate in what they do is they are the ones who decide what gets censored, what doesn't get censored, what goes out, how many people, when you do your posts, how many people reach those posts and things like that. So there are many State Department organizations that handle that do that kind of thing. So there really is a ton of censorship, and that's why the only narrative you see is the U.S. narrative, saying this is a Russian invasion, just a land grab, and all of these things. And there's a lot of, and the way they do it, you know, they don't mention the invitation from these two republics. They don't mention the massacre that was about to occur, and they do that. But there's a lot of folks who are, you know, criticize Russia also for the intervention because they say that, well, maybe it united Europe. Well, okay, well, even if it did, I mean, shouldn't they have stopped the massacre? Isn't that important about the people of Donbass? But is it true that they united Europe? Well, let's look at another journalist who's a very well-known journalist. Maybe not here, but he's a TV host, and his name is Saeed Naqvi, and he writes for the Indian Observer. And he wrote an article about a leaked message, a leaked conversation from President Macron, French President Macron. And basically, Macron was telling his French ministers, that U.S. hegemony, Western hegemony is now coming to an end. And he said that France gave the world culture. And he said, England gave the world, yeah, you know these folks. England gave the world, what did they give? England gave the world industry. America gave the world war. And he started to talk about how the Chinese and Russian diplomats were so much better than the U.S. diplomats. He mentioned that 700 million people were taken out of poverty by China, as opposed to the market economy in France, which is creating inequality at an unprecedented rate. Wow, he said all that, but he thought he wasn't talking to anybody. That's how it got leaked. Now, when Zelensky came to Washington and he was begging for the weapons of mass destruction, more weapons of mass destruction from Washington, there was a reporter that asked Biden at the press conference, why haven't they sent even more advanced weaponry to Ukraine? So Biden said, when I quote, "The idea that we would give Ukrainian material that is fundamentally different than is already going there would have a prospect of breaking up NATO and breaking up the European Union and the rest of the world." So it doesn't sound like they're too united there. But then he says, it gets worse. He said, I've spent several hundred hours face-to-face with our European allies and the heads of state of those countries, and making the case as to why it was overwhelmingly in their interest that they continue to support Ukraine. Ouch, sounds like a lot of arm twisting there. And then he said, they're not looking to go to war with Russia. They're not looking for a third world war. How dare they? You know. So he ends this whole fiasco thing with this. He says, "There's more to say, but I've probably already said too much." Yep, dummy, you did. Now, if you look in deeper into Europe and you go down deep enough to see what the working class is doing, you'll see that there are tens of thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of people that are demonstrating against either the war, but they're definitely demonstrating against the rising in prices, the gas prices, the pushing of these prices that push them into poverty, and very angry about the fact that their governments are doing this at the behest of the United States proxy war against Ukraine. See, so if when you talk about unity you can't just focus on the ruling class dynamics that are going on. You have to look at what the working class is doing, because that sometimes has the potential for the greatest impact on our future. So it can't be missed. Now, there's another person, Thierry Messon, I pronounced that right. He's a political consultant. He was a political consultant for Libya and Syria. And he started this publication and writes for it called Voltaire Network, which is a really good news source. It comes out of France. And he wrote an article that's called The World Order Already Changed in 2022. And he makes the case that this Russian intervention, helped spur on the unity, not disunity, but he's not just talking about Europe. He's talking about the African peoples and the countries that are very upset with the United States war on terror, because they say it's creating more terrorists. And these terrorists they create, sometimes the US works with when it's in their interest. They're really upset about the fact that all of these weapons of mass destruction by the US are going to Ukraine, but a lot of them are ending up on shopping sites in the dark web for terrorists. Then he talks about how India is getting around the sanctions by the US that the US imposed with this war. And they're making corridors, India's making corridors to Iran, and they're making corridors, Mumbai already has a connection to Moscow and St. Petersburg. And China is building roads from east to west all over Eurasia. So a lot of these things are happening now, which shows, and these relationships aren't imperialist relationships. In the most part, they're not exporting capital. These are relationships where it's helping to develop the infrastructure of the developing countries. So there's a lot of mutual interest in these things. So that kind of just tells us that, if you're just looking, if the light coming into your eyes is just reflecting Europe, then you're just going to have a Eurocentric view, and you're going to miss what's going on in the global South. So the African, Asian, Latin American countries, they might have a different view, and they might represent a strength, that's a collective strength that's even stronger than Europe. But I talked a lot about, let me see what time it is here. Okay, still here. So I talked a lot about Russia and that stuff, which is very important, because you do have to pop holes in the justifications for this war to build the anti-war movement. It's very important, but we also have to talk about the people who are actually planning this war. Now, there's a document that just came out this year. It comes out every year by the State Department. It's called the National Defense Strategy document, and it was blessed by President Biden, who's quoted in the introduction. And it basically, right out of the bat, it talks about how China and what's R?
Croatia?
No, I had an acronym, and my acronym is not working. CRID, C-R-I-D. China.
Russia.
Not Russia. Well, damn. Okay. Well, anyway. Wow. Sometimes your memory tricks just don't work. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Iran, I don't know what the R was, and China are threats to national security. Severe threats, maybe it was Russia. Severe threats to national security. And they say that what they have to do now is make NATO more powerful and nuclear capable, especially in regards to surrounding Russia. And then they go on to talk about China. They say China, though, is the number one national security threat, and they need to foment provocations in the South China Sea. And they even go so far as to say that the United States needs to start training Taiwan in asymmetrical warfare against China. Now, asymmetrical warfare is guerrilla war. So it just shows where these folks are at and how dangerous they are. They don't mind about and how we can't really depend on Biden, other Democrats, other Republicans to get us out of this mess, this push towards World War III. And the other blowback from this war, which I haven't talked about yet, was, there are people that say, oh, well, they're only 2% of the parliament, the Nazis, and which I don't know if that's true or not anymore, but, they say all these things.
It's enough to be a percentage?
Yeah, right. And then they say that, it's just something from the past. But people who kind of say that are callously ignoring the fact that 10 black people were killed at the top supermarket in Buffalo, New York. They were killed by a 18-year-old white supremacist who was wearing the Sonoran, the one I saw in Krimskaya. And he said he was influenced by a person in New Zealand called Brenton Tarrant. Brenton Tarrant was killed 51 Muslims in a mosque. And in his manifesto, he wrote that he was in direct communication with the Azov battalion. And then he said that he was going to go there for military training. And in fact, Time magazine said in 2019, they interviewed an former FBI agent who said admitted that 17,000 white supremacists from around the world had gone through Ukraine for military training. That's how dangerous these folks are. But we can't trust the FBI because who do they target? Have they gone after the Klan? No. Have they gone after the Proud Boys or anybody? But they did go after the African People's Socialist Party. So we can't trust them. We can't trust them. And if we put all of our hopes in the politicians to stop this war and to stop this white supremacy that's going on in the police departments and everywhere, then we're going to see a bunch of burning churches like in burning churches in Birmingham. So what we have to do is we have to say no to this war and no to the people who are dying from prices or drowning in prices right now. In LA, the Department of Water and Power made an announcement. The gas prices seem to be going down for cars, but they made an announcement saying that your utilities are going to be drastic. They had a whole press conference for this. I've never seen that before. Your utilities, get ready, your utility is going to go drastically up. Are our wages going drastically up?
No.
And in states like this, in New Orleans, so-called right-to-work states, are your wages going to go up? No. Nowhere their wages are not going up the way inflation is going up and pushing people into poverty. Climate change, they're spending from last February to January about $113 billion so far. If you go back to 2002, it's probably $200 billion. But all of that money just exacerbates the domestic problems. It exacerbates climate change. There are whole species of life that are being wiped out because of climate change, and they're not doing anything else. There are hurricanes that are killing people, the typhoids and the typhoons. So all of these things are happening, and it's not helping. That's not helping one bit. There are immigrant peoples who are being kidnapped in Texas and other places, and they're being denied their human right to asylum. And don't think that this is going to that the U.S. is not irresponsible enough to actually push World War III, because if you remember, in 80,000 people, talk about killing civilians, they killed 80,000 people in seconds in Hiroshima, and then 140,000 died slower and more torturously. And you'd think they'd say, oh my God, look what we did, this is horrible. No, they said, let's do it again. They did it again in Nagasaki. So these folks, you cannot reach them. They have no soul. You can't reach them. I'm an atheist, but I still say that. You can't reach them through their conscience. They don't have a conscience. They only respond to power. So we've got to build our power to be able to stop this war. And we do have the power to stop it. There's an example in LA in 2006. There was this horrible bill called the Sensenbrenner Bill, HR 4438. And the immigrant community got together, and they had a demonstration on March 25th, 2006, and they had 1 million people out in the street. And that reverberated around the whole country. And other folks said, oh yeah, this is what we need to do. It inspired that. So on May 1st, there were not only demonstrations in LA, but all over the country, there were this demonstration against this bill. Now this bill had already gone through the House, which would had more Democrats at the time. And that was gonna go easily past through the Senate, it had more Republicans. But on May 1st, this demonstration happened, another 1 million people came out, but it happened on a Monday. It happened on a work day. Those folks didn't go to work. And the corporations lost billions of dollars, magnified around the country. And guess what happened to that bill? It just disappeared. It didn't make it to the Senate floor. They didn't have to hire any lobbyists. They didn't have to have an election and do all the legislative stuff. They just showed their power, their labor power, and they withheld it. So we've got the power to move mountains. We've got the power to obliterate mountains. We just have to be clear about who our enemies really are. Our enemy is not Russia. Our enemy is not China. Our enemy is US imperialism and their attack dog, NATO. And it's about time we put that rabid dog down. Woo! We're gonna abolish NATO now. That's short, 30 seconds ago.
Thank you so much, John. In the interest of time, I'm going to invite Gabrielle up here without giving her a lengthy introduction.
Thank God.
Never mind the fact that she'll kill me if I do. So Gabrielle Gemma of Workers' Voice Socialist Movement. We welcome you. And
Thank you, Joseph.
yeah, of course.
Thank you, Edith, John, and Alex. Right now, there is a struggle that's going on in Congress that we should pay very careful attention to. That is very much linked to the U.S. capitalist assault, U.S. NATO capitalist assault in the Ukraine, and the rise of militarism by the economic system of capitalism in the United States, which is increasingly turning towards military production versus civilian production. And I'll get back to that in terms of why that's a disaster for the working class, not a boon for it. They made some fun and say, oh, the Republicans, they're all divided over the Speaker of the House. Well, you know, the Democrats and Republicans, no matter what they say, they are all there for the purpose of ensuring the continuation and the proliferation of the exploitation of workers and oppressed people here and around the world. That is their function. And when they talk about the national security interests of the United States and other parts of the world, and what used to be called the War Department, by the way, is now called the Defense Department, they are talking about the interests of the corporations, and they are talking about the interests of the super wealthy and rich. They are not talking about the interests of the working class, of oppressed nationalities, of oppressed people. That's who they're talking about, their national interests are. They're not our interests, they're those interests of the capitalist class. So they had this, the Democrats are like, oh, see how disunited they are? Like, they would be happier if they were united, right? What were they fighting over? Whether or not there's going to be the threat of massive cuts to social benefits in the federal budget, which is already over 60% goes to the military. And by the way, the direct military budget is only a part of it. The $840 billion that they voted on with the Democrats and the Republicans hugging each other and dancing around the maypole over the fact that year after year that budget just keeps increasing, and not just by inflation. At the end of World War II, the military budget for the United States was $15 billion. If you figure out the inflation, it would be $178 billion today. Not that we would be for it, but that's what it would be. Not $840 billion. But then there's also the space wars, and there's the CIA, and there's the Energy Department, and the nuclear weapons, and all the covert actions, and the supplemental appropriations. And there's so many different agencies and mechanisms that we don't even know all of them ourselves, adding up to well over $1 trillion, which, as Edith said, what is $1 trillion? You know, I ask this always, what's $1 billion? It's 1,000 million. And $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. It's like you can't even think about it. So they get together and they all hug each other and over this festival, this vultures festival of a military budget. And it's not enough. You know, you don't go, they don't sell their weaponry to you. You don't go and say, hey, I'd like a cruise missile. You know, these are commodities, capitalist commodities that are being produced for profit that have no use for the people. They're instruments of destruction, not use. And so they go ahead and they keep building it up. And so the sector of capitalist profiteering and production, it becomes an increasing part of the economy, the capitalist economy of the United States. In addition, it puts its tentacles out everywhere. So you don't buy the missiles. Who buys them? Who buys them? Government. Sometimes they force them, the US government acts as a salesperson, as a sales agent for the defense corporation, the military corporations. Don't forget defense, it's not about defense. And the military corporations, and they foist them on other countries of the world, and then they have to take out loans, and then they're told they have to cut their subsidies for bread and gasoline and cooking oil in order to pay for US missiles that are being exported from the United States for profit. So every university, every type of industry, be it a laundry, being it a clothing manufacturing, be it a shoe manufacturer, everybody is running to the trough of some kind of a military contract. The social media companies are completely in league with the military, with multiple billion-dollar contracts for everything. It's an octopus that has spread through society like a total disease, worse than COVID. And thank you for wearing masks, by the way. This is what has happened in U.S. society. So what has this got to do with the Ukraine, and what has this got to do with what we need, what the work is for us? This is not about, there are some people who believe, well, change the politicians, you change the policy. That the problem in Ukraine, or the problem with militarism, or the problem with fossil fuel, the problem with the destruction of the planet, it's all, if we only wait and somehow elect better politicians, these policies will change. But they won't change. In fact, every year, even those politicians that considered themselves to be liberal, even though they were supporters of the system, liberal, bend under the weight of the encroaching right wing and give up on things. So what they would so here you have the budget, the military budget rising, the government taking our money to pay for it, as was explained. And what do you have to do in order to keep that going? It's not really about a deficit. Whose deficit is it? Who gets the deficit? I mean, did we ever ask ourselves this? $400 billion a year in interest payments to the banks due to militarization. Banking institutions, $400 billion a year. Add that to the military budget because it's a reflection of it. It's the federal budget which belongs to us. And if they want to keep militarizing, they're going to have to, so what they say is, well, all of a sudden, people are really, again, this comes up over and over again, about every 10 years, this deficit thing. It's like big deal, But when they really get adamant about it, they do it for the purpose of cutting the social benefits of the people. And they are threatening both in the federal government and they are threatening in the state of Louisiana to cut the budget. There are 700,000 people in the state of Louisiana on Medicaid. There's about 500,000 people that are on SNAP, food stamp benefits. Maybe they won't cut it all together. Maybe they'll privatize it. Maybe they'll cut back on what you can get. They usually do that. As a person who's older, I can tell you that the things that you're looking at today did not start under Trump. We have been losing social benefits now for 4 decades. That's the way they do it, and it's in direct relation to the militarization of industry. And it's not only from an economic point of view. You got to keep taking this money. In the state of Louisiana, you got to keep taking the money from the budget, and you've got to give it in subsidies to the oil companies. You've got to give it in tax exemptions and deductions and outright subsidies to chemical companies, regardless of how they're destroying the environment and destroying the communities, particularly in the black communities of the state of Louisiana. They don't care. These governments, the way you look at a government, has to change in case you still look at it as some expression of democracy. How do you get to become elected? You've got to have money. There is no such thing as a fair and free election. It is huge money gets poured into anything, whether it's the mayor, the city council, the governor. I forgot what they spent on the last governor's election, some unbelievable, like $900,000, or what was it, 9 million? It was some huge. Louisiana's only got a population of a little over 5 million. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. It had a population of 5 million. And yet they spend all this money. Why do they spend all this money? To make sure they have the right politician in place, be it a Democrat or be it a Republican, is to ensure the continued exploitation of the workers' labor, and to ensure that everything is done to keep corporate profits flowing, regardless of the cost to the people. And in order to do this, they also must keep down, throughout particularly the South, but not solely, but mostly in the South, $7.25 minimum wage hasn't been raised since 1969. No, not 69, 2009. Thank you. I'm just saying if you're listening. And so now they talk about, we have to deal with the deficit, but we're not going to deal with repudiating the debt that was caused by militarism, the $400 billion. We're not going to cut the military budget. We're going to cut the people. This is the result of militarization. The other result of militarism is political. In order to keep the people from rising up over the conditions, as they are doing in other parts of the world, and as John mentioned, do people know that there is a general strikes going on in France over them raising the retirement age to 62? Ours is what now, 67 for just for Social Security? And they're having a general strikes over it. Strikes all over England, strikes all over in other places. People rising up against gasoline prices while the oil companies are making record profits. No attempt to issue a price control or to roll back the prices, and all such nonsense of a windfall profit tax going into the coffers of the U.S. Treasury, which they'll all turn over to the military industries. Instead of not going in your pocket. And besides which, they don't pay taxes anyway. They write it all off. I looked it up, trust me. What happens politically is these are the most reactionary sector of the capitalist class, the military industries. And in order to fuel the ability to pull the wool over the eyes of the people and continue this robbery that is going on, to line their own pockets, where we have seen the most extreme concentration of wealth that we've ever seen before, where 1% of the population owns more than 50% of the least income of the population. I mean, this accumulation of extreme wealth at one, and it's continuing. The monopolization of industries, the bank mergers, the company mergers, this extreme concentration of capital. But yet, they're not getting enough profit from it. So they continue to go on their military wars to try to dominate. One of the things John was mentioning, national security policy. They now have a policy which is called full spectrum dominance. Well, they don't think any of us are going to look at these reports and see this stuff. To us, it's like, no, this is a war for democracy, and this is a war for national interest, and this is terrible, and China's going to take everybody's job, and all this kind of stuff. those are the things that they tell the people here. But in reality, what's going on is this extreme rise of the right wing is associated and connected to the need for them to prepare themselves to stop people from rising up against what's being done to the people at home. The intensification of racism, the intensification of the lack of equality for women by not having reproductive rights. Let's be clear what this attack on abortion is about. These rotten elements, they don't care about abortion. Everybody in their families get abortions. They just travel somewhere else to get it. They want to control what women can do. The attacks on trans people, the attacks on LGBTQ people, this is all the attacks, the most vicious and inhumane attacks on migrant workers, people just like ourselves who are imprisoned without any trial, without any end in sight in Louisiana, which is ground zero for immigration prisons in the United States, while they make money off of these detention centers, you know, like they make money off the prison system. They need these distractions, they need this rise in right-wing policy in order to divide us. It is extremely important that they divide up the working class by trying to turn people against immigrants, or turn white workers against black workers, or turn black workers against migrants, or turn whatever might go on, or turn and control people. Because what they're planning to do to the working class in the United States, and what has been happening consistently over the last number of years, is not any great boon to the working class from militarism. It's its opposite. It's an addiction. The capitalist governments are addicted to gambling. They are addicted to fossil fuels. But not because there's no other way that we can do it. It's because they are addicted to preserving these things for profit. We are coming into a period, so this militarism has its political component. And this, given that the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, with a very few exceptions, are there to make sure that what is preserved is the creation of profits and the extraction of wealth from around the world. You know, Zelensky recently had a meeting with the head of BlackRock, the biggest hedge fund in the entire world. They sat down to have a discussion of how BlackRock could help Zelensky government and the fascists sell off the infrastructure of the Ukraine to foreign capital. And in actuality, this is the big problem that the US has with Russia. Putin was a good friend of the United States. Nobody's defending Putin, but having a U.S. invasion and destruction of Russia is not going to help the people of Russia standing up and fighting for more rights or a more prosperous life after they lost so much with the end of socialism. Not at all. Somebody in this room tell me when there was one time when U.S. intervention, either militarily or economically or politically, enhance the prosperity or the democratic rights of the people that the U.S. intervened in. Show me one case where that would happen. In every single case, the people became more impoverished. Throughout Eastern Europe is now basically a neo-colony of U.S. imperialism and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And that is what's happened to Ukraine. And that what they really got pissed at Russia for was the fact that they wouldn't allow foreign capital to purchase, specifically ExxonMobil, to purchase their state-owned oil companies and their utilities and their infrastructure and allow them to do it. Regardless of the fact that Russia is now a capitalist country, they have a right to sovereignty. They have a right not to be told what to do. And we look forward to a resurgence of the socialist movement in Russia, not a domination by U.S. imperialism, which will serve to impoverish and to politically repress the people of Russia, who are made up of many, many nationalities, by the way. So we have to really understand that, but they're not invincible. You know, one of the problems is, you take a look at all this debate that's going on in so-called debate in New Orleans about the crime problem. much of which is heartbreaking from the point of view of the self-destruction it causes to those who might get caught up in it. But at the same time, there's not one word said, not one word is said about how the hospitality industry is stealing $300 million a year in taxes that does not go into the budget. Not one word is said about all the tax deductions and exemptions and subsidies that are being given to corporations that are not going to the people. Not one word is said about all these so-called jobs that are coming into New Orleans are being taken by professionals who are moving to New Orleans so they can be served, waited on, and orchestrated to by the black community of New Orleans and its culture, and not be able to take advantage of any of it. Marigny and Bywater used to be 70% black population. It's now 17%. That's gentrification. Nothing is done about that. When people are excluded, despised, the object of racism, and excluded from society, they're going to act out, sometimes inappropriately and sometimes with revolution. And that's our message to the youth. Organize. Not to preach to them when we're not doing anything about the situation, but to have confidence of them that they will have that ability to do that, as youth have in every country that has faced a liberation struggle ever in its life, and which was so much a part of the great struggles in the United States. We have that faith. It's crime, anyway. This is going on everywhere across the United States. This intensification of wealth, this intensification of creating apartheid-type cities, and also the issue of the workers as a whole getting blasted by the military budgets. We are missing out. Here you have a capitalist class that is stealing the wealth of the world, that are living with 14 mansions and swimming pools and everything else, that are stealing the money from the governments, that are funding and paying and buying the governments. They call them campaign contributions. We call them bribes. You don't give somebody money for nothing when you don't get anything in return for it. These are bribes. These are made to ensure that these individuals become wealthy themselves. The Landrys, the Hewitts, who used to be an oil company executive, and Schroeder, and all the rest of them. That's who they're in the pocket of, and that's who they are. And they got to make sure that that continues. But what we need to do is expose them. I can't think of a time in my own lifetime where the extremes of what they are doing to the people is so extreme, what they are gathering in their own pockets at the expense of the people of the United States, the working class and oppressed people of the United States and the world, that we shouldn't be exposing them in clear and simple language for the crooks, the robbers, and the thieves that they are. And we need to reject and stand with international solidarity of the peoples of the world. There is nothing about militarism. This is not World War II and the Great Depression, where militarism did play a role in the end of that depression. This is its opposite right now. This is causing a recession and a depression. If people don't have money in their pockets, they can't buy things. If they can't buy capitalist commodities, then it becomes a recession or a depression. They are caught in a cycle that they can't get out of their own creation. And we look forward to the time when the workers and oppressed peoples of the entire world will rise up in solidarity with each other and do away with the private property and the private profits and the theft of everything. That the only reason why there is mass hunger in the world, when there is a plenty of food in the world for everybody, is because it's not produced as a necessity, it's produced for profit and withheld for profit. And that's the only reason. And it's up to us. But in order to do that, we have to go to the workers. Whether we're standing on a street corner, look at the map of Louisiana. The poverty level in Shreveport, 30% of people in Shreveport are living in poverty. Keep in mind, when you hear these poverty statistics, they are not accurate. There's a lot of people not only left out of statistical gathering, but the amount of money that they're basing it on is outdated. There are places in Louisiana, upstate Louisiana, where poverty is almost 50%. There are places in New Iberia, in white working class areas, where the poverty is almost 30%. We're not going to turn over the entire white working class to the right wing and the Nazis. We're gonna go to them and argue with them and talk to them and pressure them and stand up to racism. We're not going to get anywhere if we don't have the gumption to oppose the capitalists of this country who are so destroying the world and destroying the peoples of this state. And without solidarity and having the determination, wherever racism rears its ugly head, to fight it, not to ignore it. Wherever any oppression exists, to get up and stand up and fight it. And at the same time, fight for the unity of the working class, to liberate humanity from the evils of war, racism, oppression of all kinds, and for what we know is possible, that based on the enormous wealth that the working class produces, to have equal and good and prosperous and wonderful lives filled with peace and happiness and joy for the peoples of the earth.
Thank you, Gav. So we have the